Some folks say a broken heart never truly heals, it just learns to beat around the cracks. In the dusty town of Bitter Ridge, Cain McAllister was living proof of that painful truth. They called him Blackcoat Cain, the richest man in 3 counties and the coldest too. After losing everything that mattered, he buried his heart deeper than any gold mine. Then came Mary Ellen, a quiet housemaid who swept more than just floors. She had gentle hands and eyes that didn't flinch when others looked away. Slowly, her simple kindness began melting the ice around his heart. But what secret was Mary Ellen hiding that could change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Bitter Ridge, painting the weathered buildings in shades of amber and dust. This was a town that knew hardship like an old friend, one that settled into your bones and never quite left. The main street stretched between rows of false-fronted buildings, their paint peeling like dried skin, while the smell of sage and leather hung thick in the desert air. At the far end of town, where the road curved toward the mountains, stood the McAllister Ranch House, a sprawling monument to one man's relentless ambition. The 2-story structure dominated the landscape with its dark timber and iron fixtures, casting a shadow that seemed to reach into the very heart of Bitter Ridge itself. Inside the grand study, Cain McAllister sat behind a mahogany desk that had cost more than most folks in town made in a year. His fingers traced the surface of a silver pocket watch, its hands frozen at 3:17, the exact moment his world had shattered 5 years ago. The watch had belonged to his father, passed down through 3 generations of McAllister men who'd built this empire from nothing but determination and desert sand. Cain's reflection caught in the watch's polished surface, a face carved by grief and hardened by isolation. At 38, his black hair showed the first traces of silver at the temples, and his dark eyes held the weight of a man who'd seen too much loss. The expensive black coat that earned him his nickname hung perfectly tailored across his broad shoulders, a uniform of authority that kept the world at arm's length. The tragedy had come without warning on a spring morning much like this one. Sarah, his beloved wife of 6 years, had taken their 4-year-old son Thomas for a ride to see the wildflowers blooming in the high meadow. The storm had blown in fast and furious, turning the creek into a raging torrent that swept away everything in its path. By the time the ranch hands found them, it was too late. Cain had buried his heart with them that day, sealing it beneath layers of business deals and calculated cruelty. He'd transformed from a loving husband and father into something harder than the granite peaks that surrounded his land. The townspeople learned quickly to fear the man who could foreclose on their farms with a signature or buy out their businesses on a whim. The sound of boots on polished wood interrupted his brooding. His foreman, Jake Morrison, appeared in the doorway, a grizzled man whose weathered face told stories of 30 years working cattle under the unforgiving Montana sun. "Boss, the new girl's here," Jake said, removing his hat. "The housekeeper you hired from the agency in Helena." Cain barely looked up from his papers. "Show her to Mrs. Patterson's old room. Make sure she understands the rules." "Yes, sir. She seems different from the others, though. Quiet-like, but not in a scared way. They're all different until they see what working here really means," Cain replied coldly. "Most don't last a month." Indeed. The parade of housekeepers and servants had been constant since Sarah's death. Some fled after witnessing his volcanic temper during business meetings. Others simply couldn't tolerate the oppressive silence that filled the grand house like a living thing. The lucky ones found excuses to leave before Cain's harsh words and impossible standards broke their spirits entirely. As Jake's footsteps faded down the hallway, Cain returned to his correspondence. Letters from politicians seeking his influence, contracts requiring his signature, and reports from his various business interests across 3 counties. Each paper represented another layer of armor around his wounded soul. The McAllister empire stretched far beyond cattle ranching. Kane owned the general store, the grain elevator, and had significant stakes in the silver mine that kept Bitter Ridge from becoming another ghost town. His influence reached into every corner of local politics, and his money spoke louder than any man's vote. It was power born from pain, a desperate attempt to control a world that had proven it could take away everything he loved in a single, terrible moment. Outside his window, the town carried on its daily rhythm. Shopkeepers swept their storefronts, children played in the dusty streets, and women gathered at the well to share news and gossip. But there was always an undercurrent of tension when Kane's name was mentioned, respect mixed with fear, like townspeople discussing a sleeping mountain that might erupt without warning. The church bell had fallen silent years ago, not from disrepair, but from Kane's deliberate intervention. After the funeral, he'd purchased the small wooden church from the struggling congregation and promptly ordered the bell removed. Some sounds, he'd told the shocked parishioners, are better left unheard. The building still stood, but its doors remained locked, another symbol of Kane's rejection of faith and community. As the afternoon wore on, Kane found his attention wandering from his papers to the sounds drifting through the house. Instead of the usual nervous scurrying he'd grown accustomed to from previous housekeepers, he heard something different: measured footsteps, the gentle rattle of cleaning supplies, and what sounded almost like humming. The humming puzzled him most of all. Who would dare express such contentment under his roof? The melody was soft and unfamiliar, carrying through the walls like a ghost of happiness he'd forgotten existed. It stirred something uncomfortable in his chest, a reminder of mornings when Sarah had hummed while preparing breakfast, when Thomas had giggled from his high chair, when this house had been filled with love instead of shadows. By evening, Kane's curiosity had grown into something approaching irritation. He made his way to the kitchen, ostensibly to review the household accounts with his new employee. What he found there stopped him in the doorway. The woman stood at the large wooden table, carefully mending a tablecloth with stitches so small and precise they seemed to disappear into the fabric. She was perhaps 25, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun that revealed the graceful curve of her neck. Her grey dress was plain but clean, and her movements held a quiet confidence that spoke of dignity rather than subservience. When she looked up and met his eyes, Kane felt something shift in the carefully constructed walls around his heart. Her gaze was steady and warm, holding neither the fear he'd grown accustomed to nor the calculating interest that gold diggers had shown him over the years. Instead, there was something that looked almost like understanding, as if she could see the pain he worked so hard to hide. "Mr. McAllister," she said, setting down her needle, "I'm Mary Ellen Walsh. Thank you for the opportunity to work here." Her voice carried a slight Irish lilt that softened the edges of her words. When she stood, Kane noticed she was tall for a woman, with hands that showed the calluses of honest work, but moved with an unexpected grace. "You've been humming," he said bluntly, the accusation hanging in the air between them. Mary Ellen's cheeks colored slightly, but she didn't look away. "I apologize if it disturbed you, sir. Sometimes I don't realize I'm doing it. It's been silent in this house for 5 years, Kane continued, his voice harsh with warning. "I prefer it that way." "Of course, sir. I understand." But something in her tone suggested she understood far more than just his preference for quiet. For a long moment they stood in the kitchen's lamplight, two souls carrying the weight of unspoken grief. Kane found himself studying the way the golden light caught the auburn highlights in her hair, the gentle strength in her hands, the compassion that seemed to radiate from her like warmth from a well-tended fire. "Dinner is ready whenever you'd like it served," Mary Ellen said finally, breaking the spell that had settled over them. Kane nodded curtly and retreated to his study, but the image of her quiet confidence followed him. For the first time in years, the silver pocket watch felt heavy in his hands, not with the weight of frozen time, but with the possibility that time might, somehow, begin to move again. That night, as Bitter Ridge settled into the deep quiet of desert evening, two people lay awake in the same house, each wondering what tomorrow might bring. Neither could know that the careful walls they'd built around their hearts were already beginning to show the first hairline cracks, fissures, that would eventually let the light back in. The morning brought unwelcome visitors to the McAllister ranch. Kane watched from his study window as three men in expensive suits climbed down from a polished black carriage, their city clothes looking as out of place in Bitter Ridge as snow in July. The lead man carried a leather satchel that could only mean one thing: legal documents. Kane had been expecting this visit ever since the rumors started about the Continental Railroad Company's plans to expand their line through Montana Territory. His land sat directly in the path of their proposed route, a fact that made his sprawling ranch both invaluable and inconvenient to men who measured progress in miles of steel track. A sharp knock echoed through the house, followed by the sound of Mary Ellen's footsteps crossing the foyer. Kane heard the front door open and the murmur of polite conversation before she appeared in his study doorway. "Mr. McAllister, there are gentlemen here to see you. They say they're from the railroad company." "Show them in," Kane said, not looking up from the papers spread across his desk. He wanted these men to understand from the first moment that they were on his territory, subject to his rules and his timing. The three men entered with the swagger of those accustomed to getting their way through a combination of money and intimidation. The leader, a thick-set man with silver hair and calculating eyes, stepped forward with an oily smile. "Mr. McAllister, I'm Theodore Blackwood from Continental Railroad. These are my associates, Mr. Hartwell and Mr. Dixon." He gestured to the two younger men, flanking him, one thin and nervous, the other broad-shouldered, with the look of hired muscle. Kane finally looked up, his dark eyes cold as winter ice. "I know why you're here." "The answer is no." Blackwood's smile faltered slightly. "Perhaps you'd like to hear our offer before making such a hasty decision. The Continental Railroad is prepared to pay handsomely for the right-of-way through your property." "How handsomely?" Kane asked, though his tone suggested the number wouldn't matter. $50,000, Blackwood said, clearly expecting this sum to end the conversation. Kane leaned back in his chair, and for the first time that morning he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Gentlemen, I spent more than that on my wife's funeral. Your railroad can find another route." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Blackwood's facade of courtesy began to crack, revealing something harder underneath. "Mr. McAllister, I don't think you understand the situation. The Continental Railroad has government contracts, federal backing. This line will be built, with or without your cooperation." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Blackwood?" "I'm simply explaining reality. Sometimes progress requires difficult decisions. Men who stand in the way of progress often find themselves left behind." Kane rose from his chair slowly, his full height and presence filling the room with quiet menace. "Let me explain my reality, Mr. Blackwood. This land has been in the McAllister family for 30 years. My father bled for every acre. I've built an empire here, and I'll be damned if I let some railroad company tear it down for the sake of their profit margins." The man called Dixon stepped forward, his hand moving inside his coat. "Maybe the boss needs some time to think it over, Mr. Blackwood. Sometimes a man's perspective changes when he considers what he might lose if he's not reasonable." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Kane's own hand moved to the drawer where he kept his Colt .45, a weapon that hadn't been fired in anger since his army days, but remained clean and loaded out of old habit. "I think this meeting is over," Kane said quietly, but his voice carried the promise of violence. Blackwood reached into his satchel and withdrew a folded document, placing it on Kane's desk with deliberate ceremony. "This is a legal notice of eminent domain proceedings. The federal government has the authority to seize private land for public works projects. You have 30 days to reconsider our generous offer before the courts get involved. Get out of my house." The three men filed out, but Blackwood paused at the door. "One more thing, Mr. McAllister. We've heard you're quite attached to this little town. Be a shame if the railroad decided to bypass Bitter Ridge entirely when they built the new depot. Ghost towns are common in this territory, easy to create, impossible to resurrect." After they left, Kane stood alone in his study, the threatening letter in his hands. The words blurred before his eyes as memories crashed over him, memories of building this ranch with Sarah at his side, of watching Thomas take his first steps on the front porch, of believing that love and hard work could protect everything that mattered. The sound of a coffee cup being set on his desk brought him back to the present. Mary Ellen stood beside him, having entered so quietly he hadn't noticed. She'd prepared his coffee exactly as he liked it, black and strong without being asked. "Troubling news?" she asked softly. Kane looked at her, surprised by the genuine concern in her voice. Most people who worked for him kept their distance, especially when his temper was running hot. "Nothing I can't handle." Mary Ellen nodded, but her eyes lingered on the crumpled legal document. "Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones where we have to choose between what we want and what's right." "And what would you know about that?" Kane asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Instead of retreating, Mary Ellen met his gaze steadily. "I know that anger makes us do things we might regret, and I know that sometimes the people who hurt us count on that anger to make us forget who we really are." Her words hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, Kane saw himself as she must see him, a man so consumed by grief and rage that he'd forgotten how to be human. The realization was both humbling and infuriating. "Those men threaten my town," he said finally. "I heard. Will you let them win?" "What do you mean?" Mary Ellen picked up the coffee cup he'd ignored and wrapped his hands around it, her touch gentle but firm. "They want you angry. They want you to make mistakes. Men like that, they count on fear and fury to get their way. But there's more than one way to fight." Kane stared down at the coffee, feeling the warmth seep through the porcelain into his palms. When was the last time someone had shown him such simple kindness? When was the last time someone had cared enough to challenge his assumptions? "Why do you care what happens to this place?" he asked. "You've been here 2 days." Mary Ellen was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested she understood loss in ways that went beyond sympathy. "Because sometimes a place becomes more than just buildings and land. Sometimes it becomes the only home you have left." That afternoon, word of the railroad's visit spread through Bitter Ridge like wildfire. By evening, a crowd had gathered outside the general store, voices raised in worried conversation. Some talked of selling their properties and moving on. Others spoke of fighting, though none seemed sure how to battle an entity as powerful as the Continental Railroad. From his study window, Kane watched the town's reaction to the news. These people depended on him for their livelihoods, whether they worked his ranch, shopped at his store, or sold him their goods. The railroad's threat to bypass Bitter Ridge wasn't just about his land. It was about the survival of an entire community. For 5 years, he'd isolated himself from these people, treating them as subjects in his business empire rather than neighbors and friends. Now their fate was tied to his decision, and the weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a familiar burden. As darkness fell over Bitter Ridge, Kane found himself thinking not about legal strategies or business maneuvers, but about a quiet Irish voice asking whether he would let the railroad men win. The question echoed in his mind long after the town had settled into uneasy sleep, carrying with it the uncomfortable suggestion that perhaps the real battle wasn't about land or money, but about what kind of man he chose to be in the face of adversity. The days following the railroad visit brought an unexpected rhythm to the McAllister ranch. Mary Ellen moved through the house with quiet purpose, her presence somehow making the grand rooms feel less like a mausoleum and more like a home. She didn't ask permission to open curtains that had been closed for years, or to place wildflowers in the crystal vase that had gathered dust on the mantelpiece. She simply did these things with such natural grace that Cain found himself accepting changes he would have forbidden from anyone else. Each morning, she wore a simple wooden cross necklace that caught the light as she worked. It was a modest thing, carved from what looked like oak, with a smoothness that spoke of years of faithful wear. Unlike the ornate religious artifacts that had filled the house during Sarah's time, Mary Ellen's cross was humble and unpretentious, a quiet declaration of faith that neither demanded attention nor apologized for its presence. Cain watched her from the doorway of his study as she dusted the family portraits lining the hallway. Her movements were careful and reverent, as if she understood that each frame held memories too precious to disturb carelessly. When she reached the large portrait of Sarah and Thomas, the one Cain hadn't been able to look at directly for 5 years, she paused. "She was beautiful," Mary Ellen said softly, not turning around but somehow knowing he was there. "Yes," Cain replied, his voice rougher than he intended. "She was. And this handsome little fellow must be your son." The words should have brought the familiar stab of pain, but somehow Mary Ellen's gentle tone made them bearable. "Thomas. He would have been 9 this year." Mary Ellen turned then, her eyes soft with understanding. "They're still with you, you know. Love like that doesn't just disappear because the people we love are no longer here to receive it." Cain wanted to argue, to retreat behind the walls of cynicism that had protected him for so long. But there was something in her voice, a quality that suggested she spoke from experience rather than mere sentiment, that made him listen instead. "How can you be so certain?" he asked. "Because love is the one thing that death can't touch," she said simply. "The people we've lost, they live on in every kindness we show, every moment of joy we allow ourselves, every time we choose hope over despair." Before he could respond, the sound of raised voices from the front yard interrupted them. Through the window, they could see Jake Morrison talking heatedly with a man Cain didn't recognize, a tall, thin fellow in a dusty coat who kept gesturing toward the main road. Cain stepped outside, Mary Ellen following at a respectful distance. The stranger turned as they approached, revealing a face marked by worry and exhaustion. "Mr. McAllister," Jake said, "this here's Reverend Samuel Cross from over in Pine Valley. He's got some troubling news." The Reverend removed his hat, revealing thinning brown hair and eyes that held the weight of difficult tidings. "Mr. McAllister, I've heard about the railroad company's interest in your land. I'm afraid they've been making similar visits throughout the territory." "What kind of visits?" Cain asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Threats, mostly. Offers that sound generous until you realize they're accompanied by warnings about what might happen to those who refuse." Reverend Cross looked toward the mountains, where storm clouds were gathering. "3 families in my congregation have already sold their farms for less than they're worth. They were scared, Mr. McAllister. Scared of what those railroad men might do if they said no." Cain felt the familiar anger building in his chest, the cold fury that had sustained him through 5 years of isolation. But as he prepared to unleash that rage, he caught sight of Mary Ellen's cross glinting in the afternoon sunlight, and her words about love and choice echoed in his mind. "What exactly are you asking of me, Reverend?" Cain said carefully. "Nothing, sir. I'm not in a position to ask anything of a man like you. I just thought you should know that this fight is bigger than just your ranch. There are folks throughout the territory who are looking to see how you handle this situation. Some are hoping you'll show them there's another way besides running or surrendering." The weight of expectation settled on Cain's shoulders like a familiar coat. For years, he'd wielded his influence like a weapon, using fear and intimidation to get his way. Now he was being asked to use that same power differently, not to dominate but to protect. "I appreciate the information, Reverend," Cain said finally. "I'll keep it in mind." As the minister prepared to leave, he paused beside Mary Ellen, who had been listening quietly to the conversation. "That's a beautiful cross, miss. Oak, isn't it?" Mary Ellen's hand moved instinctively to the necklace. "Yes, it was carved by my..." She stopped herself, a shadow crossing her face. By someone very dear to me. Well, it's lovely work. There's something peaceful about it. After Reverend Cross departed, Kane found himself alone with Mary Ellen in the gathering dusk. The storm clouds had moved closer, bringing with them the scent of rain and the promise of change. You started to say something about who carved that cross, Kane said, surprising himself with his boldness. Mary Ellen's fingers traced the wooden surface of the necklace. Sometimes the past is too painful to put into words right away. I understand that better than most. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who had learned that grief was a language best spoken slowly and with great care. The Reverend was right, you know, Mary Ellen said finally. People are watching to see what you'll do. They're hoping you'll be the man who stands up to the bullies instead of becoming one yourself. Her words stung because they held a mirror to truths he'd been avoiding. And what makes you think I'm not already a bully? Because bullies don't bury their hearts with the people they love, she said simply. They bury other people's hearts and feel nothing at all. That evening, as the first drops of rain began to fall on the dusty streets of Bitter Ridge, Kane sat in his study with the silver pocket watch in his hands. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the moment when time had stopped. Instead, he was thinking about what Mary Ellen had said about love surviving death, about kindness being a choice, about the difference between strength and cruelty. Outside his window, he could see the light from Mary Ellen's room, where she was likely mending something or reading by lamplight. The thought occurred to him that perhaps healing wasn't about forgetting the past or moving beyond it, but about learning to carry it with grace instead of bitterness. The cross she wore spoke of faith that had been tested, but not broken. Perhaps, he thought as rain drummed against the windows, there were different ways to honor the dead than by burying oneself with them. Perhaps the real question wasn't whether he was strong enough to fight the railroad, but whether he was brave enough to start living again. The morning after the rainstorm dawned clear and bright, washing Bitter Ridge clean and filling the air with the sweet scent of sage and wet earth. Kane found himself rising earlier than usual, drawn by sounds from the kitchen that spoke of purposeful activity rather than mere chores. Mary Ellen stood at the large wooden table, her sleeves rolled up as she kneaded bread dough with practiced efficiency. But what caught Kane's attention wasn't her domestic skill. It was the book lying open beside the flour sack. Even from the doorway, he could see the neat handwriting that filled its margins, notes written in what appeared to be several different languages. "You read Latin?" he asked, stepping into the kitchen. Mary Ellen looked up, a slight flush colouring her cheeks as if she'd been caught doing something improper. And a bit of French and Spanish as well. Kane moved closer, intrigued despite himself. The book was a volume of philosophical essays, far more sophisticated than anything he'd expected to find in a housemaid's possession. That's quite an education for someone in domestic service. Education was important in my family, Mary Ellen said carefully, her hands never pausing in their rhythm. My father believed that knowledge was the one thing that could never be taken away from you, no matter how much else you might lose. The sadness in her voice suggested she'd tested that theory personally. Kane found himself studying her profile as she worked, noting the intelligence in her eyes and the careful way she chose her words. There were depths to this woman that her simple grey dress and quiet manner couldn't hide. "What happened to your family?" he asked, then immediately regretted the intrusion. He, of all people, should understand that some wounds were too fresh to examine in the light. But Mary Ellen didn't seem offended by the question. Instead, she simply said, "Life happened, Mr. McAllister, the same way it happened to you." Before he could pursue the matter further, Jake Morrison appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression grim. "Boss, we've got visitors again. Different ones this time, but they're asking about you." Kane followed Jake outside, where two men waited beside the corral. Unlike the railroad company's representatives, these men bore the dust and wear of hard travel. The older one, a thick-set man with greying hair and intelligent eyes, stepped forward with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Mr. McAllister, I'm Sheriff Tom Bradley from Helena. This is my deputy, Jim Walsh. We'd like to ask you a few questions about the Continental Railroad Company." The name Walsh made Kane glance back toward the house, but he kept his voice neutral. "What kind of questions, Sheriff?" "The kind that might help us understand why 3 surveyors have gone missing in the past 6 months, all of them working on projects that somehow interfered with railroad interests." The implications of the sheriff's words settled over Kane like a cold wind. "You think the railroad company is involved in these disappearances?" "Let's just say we're exploring all possibilities," Sheriff Bradley replied. "We've heard they made you an offer recently. How did that conversation go?" Kane recounted the meeting with Blackwood and his associates, describing the veiled threats and intimidation tactics. As he spoke, he noticed Deputy Walsh taking careful notes, his pen moving with the same precise strokes that had caught Kane's attention in Mary Ellen's marginalia. "Has anyone else approached you about this situation?" the sheriff asked. "Anyone offering information or assistance? Reverend Cross from Pine Valley mentioned that other families have been pressured to sell," Kane said. "But no one's offered to help, if that's what you're asking." Sheriff Bradley nodded thoughtfully. "Mr. McAllister, I'll be direct with you. We have reason to believe the Continental Railroad is using methods that go well beyond legal pressure. If that's true, then anyone who stands in their way might be in considerable danger." The warning hung in the air between them like gun smoke. Kane felt the familiar surge of protective instinct, but this time it wasn't just about his land or his pride. For the first time in years, he had someone he wanted to protect. "I appreciate the warning, Sheriff. I'll be careful." As the lawmen prepared to leave, Deputy Walsh approached Kane privately. "Mr. McAllister, you wouldn't happen to have hired any new staff recently, would you? Anyone who might have worked for railroad surveyors or mapping operations?" The question sent a chill through Kane's chest. "Why do you ask?" "One of the missing men was named Patrick Walsh. He was my brother." The deputy's voice remained steady, but Kane could see the pain in his eyes. "He was working on a survey of this territory when he vanished. His widow moved away after the funeral, and we haven't been able to locate her." Kane's mind raced as pieces of a larger puzzle began to fall into place. Mary Ellen's education, her knowledge of languages, her careful responses to questions about her past, and now the revelation that she shared a surname with a missing surveyor. "I'm sorry for your loss," Kane said carefully. "If I hear anything that might help your investigation, I'll contact you immediately." After the sheriff and his deputy left, Kane returned to the house with his thoughts churning. He found Mary Ellen in the parlor, dusting the bookshelves with meticulous care. When she looked up at him, he saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a wariness that suggested she'd overheard more of the conversation than she'd let on. "Mary Ellen," he said gently, "is there anything you need to tell me?" For a long moment she stood frozen with the dustcloth in her hands. Then, slowly, she reached into the pocket of her apron and withdrew a small, faded photograph. With trembling fingers, she handed it to him. The image showed a young woman, Mary Ellen, but with a joy in her face that was absent, now standing beside a tall, bearded man and a small boy with dark hair and serious eyes. All 3 were dressed in their Sunday best, and the happiness radiating from the photograph was almost painful to witness. "Patrick was my husband," Mary Ellen said quietly. "And that little boy was our son, Michael. They died 6 months ago." Kane studied the photograph, seeing in it echoes of his own lost family portrait. "The railroad?" Mary Ellen nodded, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "Patrick discovered something about their route, something they didn't want known. They made it look like an accident, a flash flood that swept away their survey camp. But I know the truth." The weight of her revelation settled between them like a bridge across the chasm of their shared grief. 2 people who had lost everything, brought together by forces beyond their understanding, standing on the threshold of either healing or greater heartbreak. "Why didn't you tell me?" Cain asked, though he already knew the answer. "Because I was afraid you'd send me away," Mary Ellen whispered, "and because this is the first place I've felt safe since they died." Cain looked again at the photograph, seeing in the faces of her lost family the same love and promise that had once filled his own life. The realization that Mary Ellen had sought refuge in his house, that she trusted him enough to reveal her dangerous secret, stirred something in his chest that had been dormant for far too long. The revelation of Mary Ellen's true identity changed everything and nothing at the McAllister ranch. On the surface, the daily routines continued unchanged. She still prepared his meals, tended the house, and moved through her duties with quiet efficiency. But beneath the familiar patterns, an electric current of shared understanding now connected them, charged with the knowledge that they were both survivors of the same enemy. 3 days after her confession, Cain was reviewing ledgers in his study when raised voices from the yard drew his attention. Through the window, he saw one of his newer ranch hands, a burly man named Cord Brennan, cornering Mary Ellen near the well. Even from a distance, Cain could read the aggressive posture and leering expression that made his blood run cold. He was moving before conscious thought formed, crossing the house and yard with long, purposeful strides. As he drew closer, Brennan's words became audible, crude suggestions and demands that no decent woman should have to endure. "Problem here, Brennan?" Cain's voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade. The ranch hand spun around, his face flushed with drink and embarrassment at being caught. "Just having a friendly conversation with the lady, boss. No harm in that." "The lady doesn't look like she's enjoying your conversation." Cain stepped between Brennan and Mary Ellen, his presence radiating quiet menace. "In fact, she looks like she'd rather you found somewhere else to be." Brennan's jaw tightened with the stubborn belligerence of a man unused to being challenged. "She's just hired help, McAllister. Since when do you care what happens to the servants?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Cain was acutely aware of Mary Ellen standing behind him, probably wondering the same thing. When had he started caring? When had this woman's welfare become something worth fighting for? "Since now," Cain said simply. "Pack your gear, Brennan. You're no longer welcome on my land. You're firing me over some Irish tramp who—" Brennan never finished the sentence. Cain's fist connected with his jaw with the solid impact of years of frustration and protective fury. The ranch hand went down hard, blood streaming from his split lip as he struggled to regain his feet. "The next man who speaks disrespectfully about Miss Walsh will find himself in a similar position," Cain announced, his voice carrying across the yard to the other hands who had gathered to watch. "I trust that's understood." The murmur of agreement from the assembled men was immediate and sincere. They'd all seen Cain's temper over the years, but this was different. This wasn't the cold rage of a man who enjoyed inflicting pain, but the righteous anger of someone protecting what mattered to him. As Brennan slunk away to collect his belongings, Cain turned to face Mary Ellen. Her cheeks were flushed, whether from embarrassment or emotion he couldn't tell, but her eyes held something that looked like gratitude mixed with surprise. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I did." The certainty in his voice surprised them both. "No one under my protection should have to endure that kind of treatment." "Your protection?" The words came out barely above a whisper. Cain realized what he'd just revealed, that somewhere in the past few days, his feelings toward this woman had shifted from mere employer tolerance to something far more personal and dangerous. The admission should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. That evening, they found themselves sitting on the front porch as the sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. It had become an unspoken ritual over the past week, two people finding solace in shared silence after the day's work was done. Tonight, however, the air between them hummed with unresolved tension. "Tell me about him," Cain said finally. Your husband. Mary Ellen was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she spoke, her voice carried the careful cadence of someone walking through a field of painful memories. Patrick was a dreamer, she said, a small smile touching her lips. He believed in truth and justice, the way other men believe in gold or glory. When the Continental Railroad hired him to survey this territory, he thought he was helping to bring progress to the frontier. She paused, her fingers unconsciously tracing the chain that held her wedding ring, a simple iron band that she wore close to her heart, hidden beneath her dress where only she could feel its presence. What did he discover? Kane asked gently. Proof that their proposed route would deliberately bypass existing settlements in favor of land they could acquire cheaply through intimidation. Towns like Bitter Ridge would be cut off from the main line, left to wither and die, while new settlements sprang up along the railroad's preferred path. The implications hit Kane like a physical blow. The railroad wasn't just trying to acquire his land, they were planning to destroy his community entirely. That's why they killed him? Mary Ellen nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Patrick tried to go to the authorities, but the railroad had bought influence everywhere that mattered. When he wouldn't be silenced, she stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Kane found himself reaching for her hand, covering her trembling fingers with his own. The touch sent electricity through both of them, the first physical contact he'd initiated with another human being since Sarah's death. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry that you've had to carry this burden alone. I'm not alone anymore, Mary Ellen said, looking into his eyes with a directness that made his breath catch. Am I? The question held layers of meaning that went far beyond the immediate crisis. She was asking if he would stand with her against the railroad, yes, but she was also asking something far more personal, whether the connection growing between them was real, whether the walls around his heart might have room for one more person to protect. No, Kane said, his voice rough with emotion, you're not alone. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky above Bitter Ridge, two wounded souls sat together on a porch, each drawing strength from the other's presence. The iron wedding ring pressed against Mary Ellen's heart was a reminder of love lost, but the warmth of Kane's hand covering hers spoke of the possibility that love might, against all odds, be found again. Neither spoke of the danger that surrounded them or of the powerful enemy that had already taken so much from both their lives. Tonight, it was enough to sit together in the gathering darkness, no longer alone in a world that had shown them both too much cruelty, but in the shadows beyond the porchlight. Unseen eyes watched and noted the growing bond between them. The Continental Railroad had not forgotten about Kane McAllister's defiance, and they were already planning their next move in a game where the stakes kept growing higher. The discovery came by accident, as the most significant revelations often do. Kane had been looking for Mary Ellen to discuss the evening meal when he found her sitting on the floor of her small room, surrounded by the contents of what appeared to be a traveling trunk. She was holding something in her hands, turning it over with the careful reverence reserved for sacred objects. When she looked up and saw him in the doorway, her face went pale. But instead of hiding the item or making excuses, she simply held it out for him to see, a small wooden toy horse, carved with loving detail and worn smooth by countless hours of play. This was Michael's, she said quietly. Patrick carved it for his 3rd birthday. Kane stepped into the room without invitation, drawn by the raw vulnerability in her voice. The toy horse was a masterpiece of simple craftsmanship, every line and curve speaking of a father's love, translated into wood and patience. He was gifted with his hands, Kane said, accepting the toy when Mary Ellen offered it to him. Patrick said that every boy needed a horse to carry him on adventures. Her voice broke slightly. Michael used to gallop it across the kitchen table while I cooked, making the most elaborate stories about knights and dragons and far-off kingdoms. Kane studied the toy, seeing in its worn surfaces the ghost of small hands and innocent imagination. It reminded him painfully of the toys that still sat untouched in Thomas's bedroom, tin soldiers and wooden blocks that had been waiting 5 years for their owner to return. "How old was he?" Kane asked gently. 4. He would have been 5 next month. Mary Ellen wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Sometimes I wake up thinking I hear his laughter in the morning or his footsteps running down the hallway. Then I remember, and the silence feels like it might swallow me whole." The description hit Kane with the force of recognition. How many mornings had he experienced that same cruel awakening? How many times had he heard phantom echoes of Thomas's voice calling for Papa, only to face the empty reality of loss all over again? "The silence is the hardest part," he said, settling beside her on the floor without thinking about propriety or position. "Not just the quiet, but the waiting for sounds that will never come." Mary Ellen looked at him with eyes that held perfect understanding. "You know, don't you? You know exactly what it feels like." "Every day," Kane admitted. "For 5 years, every single day." They sat together, surrounded by the scattered remnants of Mary Ellen's former life letters from Patrick, a pressed flower from their wedding bouquet, a small Bible with pages softened by frequent reading. Each item told a story of love and loss that mirrored Kane's own experience. "Sometimes I wonder if loving someone is worth the pain of losing them," Mary Ellen said, her fingers tracing the toy horse's mane. "Sarah used to say that love was like planting a garden," Kane replied, the words coming from a memory so deep he'd forgotten he still carried it. "She said you plant it knowing that winter will come, but you do it anyway, because the beauty and joy are worth the inevitable season of loss." She sounds like she was very wise. She was. Too wise for someone who died so young. Kane took a shaky breath. "I used to think that if I just refused to care about anything or anyone again, I could avoid that kind of pain. But these past few weeks—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought that had been forming in his mind, that these past few weeks with Mary Ellen had awakened something in him that he'd thought was buried forever, that her presence had made him realize that avoiding love wasn't avoiding pain, it was just choosing a different, slower kind of death. "These past few weeks have been different," Mary Ellen finished for him, her voice soft with understanding. "Yes." The single word hung between them, loaded with all the implications neither was quite ready to voice. They were two people standing at the edge of something that could either heal them or destroy them completely, the terrifying possibility of loving again. A sharp knock on the front door interrupted the moment, followed by the sound of urgent voices in the hallway. Kane rose quickly, helping Mary Ellen to her feet as Jake Morrison's voice called out with unmistakable urgency. "Boss!" They hurried to the front of the house, where Jake stood with 3 men Kane recognized as local ranchers. Their faces were grim, and all 3 clutched their hats in white-knuckled grips that spoke of bad news. "What's happened?" Kane demanded. "The Hendersons' place," said Bill Hawthorne, the eldest of the 3. "Someone burned them out last night, torched the barn, ran off their cattle, left a message nailed to what's left of their front door." "What kind of message?" Hawthorne reached into his coat and withdrew a piece of paper, the edges blackened by smoke. The words were printed in block letters that seemed to shout their threat from the page. "Sell or suffer, Continental Railroad Company." Kane felt Mary Ellen stiffen beside him. The railroad had escalated from verbal threats to actual violence, proving that their earlier warnings hadn't been empty bluster. "Anyone hurt?" Kane asked. "No, thank God," replied Tom Martinez, another of the ranchers. "The family got out safe, but they've lost everything. Henderson says he's selling to the railroad, doesn't matter what they're offering. He can't risk his family's lives." The message was clear to everyone present. The Continental Railroad was done with subtle pressure and legal maneuvering. They were prepared to use terror and violence to get what they wanted, and the Henderson farm was just the beginning. "This won't end with one farm," Mary Ellen said quietly, speaking the truth they were all thinking. "They'll keep escalating until everyone either sells or flees." Kane looked around at the faces of his neighbors, men who had worked this land for decades, who had built lives and families in the shadow of the mountains that surrounded Bitter Ridge. They were looking to him for leadership, for some sign that there was a way to fight back against an enemy with unlimited resources and no apparent conscience. "What do you want us to do, Kane?" Hawthorne asked. "Some folks are talking about organizing a resistance, but others think we should just take what we can get and move on while we still can." The weight of decision pressed down on Kane's shoulders like a physical burden. For 5 years, he'd used his power purely for his own benefit, caring nothing for the community that depended on him. Now that same community was asking him to be something he'd never been, a leader who put others before himself. He felt Mary Ellen's hand slip into his, her touch offering silent support and strength. The toy horse was still clutched in her other hand, a reminder that some things were worth fighting for, even in the face of overwhelming odds. "We don't run," Kane said finally, his voice carrying the authority that came from absolute conviction. "We don't sell, and we don't let them terrorize our neighbors into submission. It's time the Continental Railroad learned what happens when they threaten the wrong people." The next morning brought Sheriff Bradley back to the McAllister Ranch, but this time he wasn't alone. Deputy Walsh rode beside him, along with 2 federal marshals whose brass badges caught the early sunlight like signals of hope. More importantly, they brought news that would change everything. "Mr. McAllister," Sheriff Bradley said as he dismounted, "we need to speak with you and Miss Walsh together. We've made some discoveries that put a new light on this whole railroad situation." Kane found Mary Ellen in the kitchen, where she was preparing breakfast with hands that trembled slightly, a sign that the previous night's revelations about the Henderson farm had affected her more deeply than she'd let on. When he told her about the lawmen's request, her face went pale. "They know," she said quietly, "about Patrick, about what really happened. Whatever they know, we'll face it together," Kane assured her, meaning every word. They gathered in the parlor, where Sheriff Bradley spread a collection of documents across the coffee table like pieces of a complex puzzle. Maps, surveys, legal papers, and what appeared to be correspondence filled the space between them. "Miss Walsh," the sheriff began gently, "your husband was more thorough in his record-keeping than anyone realized. We found his complete surveyor's notes hidden in a safety deposit box in Helena, along with a letter addressed to you." Mary Ellen's breath caught as Deputy Walsh, her brother-in-law, handed her an envelope bearing Patrick's familiar handwriting. With shaking fingers, she opened it and began to read, her eyes moving across the page with growing amazement. "What does it say?" Kane asked when she'd finished. "He knew," Mary Ellen whispered. "Patrick knew they were going to kill him, so he made arrangements. Legal arrangements." She looked up at the sheriff with tears in her eyes. "He filed a territorial land claim before he died, not just for the survey area, but for the entire corridor the railroad wants to use." Marshal Harrison, a tall man with iron-gray hair and steady eyes, leaned forward. "The claim is completely legal and properly filed. According to territorial law, your husband's death doesn't invalidate the claim, it transfers to his next of kin. Which means," added Marshal Thompson, the younger of the 2 federal agents, "that Mary Ellen Walsh is now the legal owner of the most crucial section of land needed for the railroad's proposed route." The magnitude of this revelation hit Kane like a physical blow. Mary Ellen wasn't just a witness to railroad corruption, she was the key to stopping their entire operation. The land deed Patrick had filed represented more than legal ownership. It was justice reaching from beyond the grave. "The Continental Railroad can't build their line without access to that corridor," Sheriff Bradley continued. "And according to territorial law, they can't use eminent domain to seize land from a private citizen unless they can prove the current route is the only viable option. But Patrick's survey notes prove there are at least 3 alternative routes that would serve the same purpose, Deputy Walsh added, his voice thick with emotion. Routes that would connect existing communities instead of destroying them. Mary Ellen stood and walked to the window, the deed clutched in her hands like a weapon of liberation. Patrick always said the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you tried to bury it. Kane joined her at the window, seeing in her profile the same mixture of grief and determination that he'd learned to recognize in his own mirror. "What do you want to do?" "I want to finish what Patrick started," she said firmly. "I want to stop them from destroying any more families, any more communities." "The railroad won't give up easily," Marshal Harrison warned. "When they realize you have the deed and the evidence to destroy their plans, they'll become desperate. Desperate men do dangerous things." "Then we'll have to be ready for them," Kane said, his voice carrying the cold determination that had built his business empire. "What do you need from us?" Sheriff Bradley gathered up the documents, his expression serious. "We need you both to come to Helena to testify before the territorial judge. With Miss Walsh's testimony about her husband's murder and the evidence he gathered, plus the legal land claim, we can get an injunction to stop all railroad construction until a full investigation is completed." "How long will that take?" Mary Ellen asked. "Weeks, possibly months," Marshal Thompson admitted. "But it will give us time to build a case that could put Blackwood and his associates in federal prison for conspiracy, murder, and fraud." The plan was sound, but Kane could see the flaw that none of the lawmen wanted to acknowledge. "They'll try to stop us from reaching Helena," he said. "The moment they realize what's happening, they'll do whatever it takes to prevent that testimony from being heard." "We've considered that possibility," Sheriff Bradley replied. "That's why we're proposing to escort you personally, along with the federal marshals. We leave tomorrow morning." After the lawmen departed to make their preparations, Kane and Mary Ellen found themselves alone with the weight of what they'd learned. The deed Patrick had filed lay on the table between them, representing both their salvation and their greatest danger. "Are you afraid?" Kane asked. "Terrified," Mary Ellen admitted. "But not of the railroad. I'm afraid of what happens after this is over, when justice has been served and the danger has passed." "What do you mean?" Mary Ellen turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I mean that all of this, us being thrown together, depending on each other, feeling like we might have a future, it all comes from tragedy and crisis. What happens when the crisis ends? What happens when you don't need to protect me anymore, and I don't need to be protected?" The question cut straight to the heart of Kane's own fears. Was what he felt for Mary Ellen real, or was it just 2 wounded people clinging to each other in a storm? Was the connection between them born of genuine affection, or simply the desperation of souls who had been alone too long? "I don't know," he said honestly. "I only know that the thought of losing you terrifies me more than anything Blackwood and his men could do." Mary Ellen stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "Then promise me something. Anything. Promise me that when this is over, when we're both safe and free to make choices without fear, you'll tell me honestly whether what's between us is real or just the product of shared danger." Kane took her hands in his, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and the trembling that revealed her vulnerability. "I promise," he said, "but I think I already know the answer." "Oh, I think what's between us started the moment you refused to be afraid of me," he said softly. "Everything else, the railroad, the danger, the shared grief that just gave us reason to stop fighting it." Mary Ellen's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "In that case, Mr. McAllister, we'd better make sure we both survive long enough to explore that possibility." As evening fell over Bitter Ridge, they stood together at the window watching the lights come on in the town below. Tomorrow would bring new dangers and the final confrontation with forces that had already claimed too many lives. But tonight, for perhaps the first time since their respective tragedies, both Kane and Mary Ellen felt something they'd almost forgotten: hope for a future that included not just survival, but the possibility of love, reborn from the ashes of loss. The deed that gave Mary Ellen control over the railroad's destiny lay on the table behind them, but the real power in the room came from two hearts that had decided to trust again, to fight not just for justice, but for the right to build something beautiful from the wreckage of what they'd lost. The night before their departure to Helena, Kane found himself in his study, staring at an object he hadn't touched in 5 years. The Colt .45 revolver lay in the bottom drawer of his desk, wrapped in oiled cloth like a sleeping serpent. Its walnut grip bore the scratches and wear of his military service, when violence had been a tool of duty rather than revenge. He'd sworn after Sarah and Thomas died that he would never again take a life in anger. The gun had remained hidden away, a symbol of the man he'd been before grief transformed him into something colder and more calculating. But tomorrow's journey would take them through territory where the railroad's hired guns held sway, where mercy was a luxury that good men couldn't afford. "Second thoughts?" Mary Ellen's voice came softly from the doorway. Kane looked up to find her silhouetted against the hallway light, her hair loose around her shoulders and her simple nightgown making her appear almost ethereal. In her hands, she carried a cup of coffee, his nightly ritual that she'd somehow remembered despite everything else occupying their minds. "Just considering all possibilities," he said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Blackwood won't let us reach Helena without a fight. When he realizes what that deed means, he'll throw everything he has at stopping us." Mary Ellen entered the study and settled into the chair across from his desk, her eyes falling on the revealed weapon. Patrick carried a gun too, near the end. He said it made him feel safer, but I think it really just made him feel more afraid. And yet here I am, making the same choice he did. "No," Mary Ellen said firmly. "Patrick carried his gun because he was alone and desperate. You're carrying yours because you have people to protect. There's a world of difference between those two motivations." Kane rewrapped the revolver and slipped it into the holster he hadn't worn since his army days. The weight of it on his hip felt both foreign and familiar, like putting on clothes that no longer quite fit, but still carried the memory of who he used to be. "Tell me about the route we'll take tomorrow," Mary Ellen said, clearly trying to distract them both from darker thoughts. "Sheriff Bradley wants to avoid the main roads," Kane explained, unfolding a map across his desk. "We'll take the mountain pass through Devil's Canyon. It's rough country, but it keeps us away from places where the railroad might have men waiting." Mary Ellen studied the map with the same careful attention she gave to everything else, her finger tracing the winding path that would carry them to safety or destruction. "How long will the journey take?" 2 days if the weather holds, 3 if we hit snow." Kane pointed to a mark on the map halfway along their route. "There's an old mining station here where we can rest the horses and spend the night. It's been abandoned for years, but the buildings are still sound. And if we're followed, then we'll deal with it when it happens," Kane said, but his hand instinctively moved to the gun at his side. "The marshals are good men, experienced fighters. Between them and Sheriff Bradley, we'll have protection." Mary Ellen nodded, but something in her expression suggested she was thinking about more than just the immediate dangers they faced. "Kane, what happens if we don't make it to Helena?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to fate itself. "We'll make it," he said firmly. "But if we don't, if something happens to me, promise me you won't let my death be for nothing. Promise me you'll find another way to stop them." "Mary Ellen, promise me," she insisted, leaning forward with an intensity that made her green eyes seem to burn. "Patrick died believing that truth and justice would eventually prevail. I need to know that if I die tomorrow, someone will carry that belief forward." Kane reached across the desk and took her hands in his, feeling the tremor of fear she was trying so hard to hide. "I promise," he said. But I also promise that I won't let anything happen to you, not while I'm breathing. And I promise the same to you, Mary Ellen replied. We're in this together now, whatever comes. They spent the next hour going over every detail of the journey, reviewing maps and discussing contingency plans until both felt they'd prepared for every possibility except the one that worried them most, that their enemies might be better prepared than they were. As the clock struck midnight, Mary Ellen rose to leave but paused at the study door. Kane? That first night, when you asked me why I was humming, do you remember what I said? You said sometimes you didn't realize you were doing it. I lied, she admitted with a sad smile. I was humming because it was the first time since Patrick and Michael died that I felt like there might be music left in the world. You did that for me, even when you were trying so hard to push everyone away. Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone with the weight of her words and the realization that tomorrow's journey would determine not just whether justice prevailed, but whether two wounded souls would survive to explore the possibility of healing together. Dawn came too soon, bringing with it the sound of horses and men preparing for a journey that might well be their last. Sheriff Bradley arrived with Deputy Walsh and the two federal marshals, all four men armed and wearing the grim expressions of those who understood the stakes involved. The railroad knows, Sheriff Bradley announced without preamble. One of my sources in Helena sent word that Blackwood left town yesterday with a dozen hired guns. They're headed this way. Marshal Harrison checked his rifle with practiced efficiency. How much of a head start do we have? Maybe 6 hours? If we're lucky, Deputy Walsh replied. But they know the territory as well as we do. Could be they're already in position along the route. Kane felt the familiar cold focus that had served him well in both war and business. Then we change the route. Take the northern trail through Copper Ridge instead of Devil's Canyon. It's longer, but less predictable. That trail hasn't been used in years, Sheriff Bradley protested. Could be washed out or blocked. Better than riding into an ambush, Kane replied. Besides, I know that country. My father used to run cattle through there before the easier passes were opened. As they made final preparations, Kane found himself checking and rechecking his weapons, his supplies, and the security of the saddlebags that held Patrick's survey notes and the precious deed that could bring down the Continental Railroad. But more than anything, he found himself watching Mary Ellen as she moved through her morning routine with calm determination. She had braided her hair severely and dressed in riding clothes that had seen better days, but there was something regal in her bearing that spoke of nobility earned through suffering rather than birth. When she saw him watching, she offered a smile that was both brave and terrified. "Ready?" she asked. "As ready as anyone can be for something like this," Kane replied. Sheriff Bradley called for everyone to mount up, and within minutes they were riding away from the McAllister Ranch toward the mountains that loomed like sleeping giants against the morning sky. Behind them, Bitter Ridge went about its daily business, unaware that the future of their community rode with the small group of riders disappearing into the wilderness. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thin and cold, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of snow. Kane rode beside Mary Ellen, close enough to offer protection, but far enough away to give the marshals clear fields of fire if trouble found them. "No turning back now," Mary Ellen said quietly, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp mountain air. "No turning back," Kane agreed. But his hand rested on the butt of his gun, and his eyes constantly scanned the ridgelines above them for signs of movement. They were committed now to a course that would either see justice done and their community saved, or would add their names to the list of those who had tried to stand against the railroad's corruption and paid the ultimate price. Either way, Kane thought as he watched Mary Ellen's determined profile against the backdrop of snow-capped peaks, they would face whatever came with courage and the knowledge that some things were worth risking everything to protect. The telegraph key sat like a lifeline on the rough wooden table inside the abandoned mining station, Marshal Harrison had rigged the portable device to the old telegraph wires that still connected the remote outpost to Helena, though whether the lines remained functional after years of neglect was anyone's guess. "If we can get word to the territorial judge," Sheriff Bradley explained as he examined the tarnished brass instrument, "he can issue an emergency injunction based on the evidence we're carrying. That would stop all railroad construction immediately, even before we arrive for the formal hearing." They had reached the mining station just as the first snow began to fall, fat flakes that turned the mountain wilderness into a crystalline wonderland that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Now the snow meant limited visibility and tracks that could be followed by their pursuers. Kane stood watch at the station's single window while Mary Ellen sorted through Patrick's survey documents, organizing them in the order that would have the greatest legal impact. Her hands moved with steady precision, despite the danger they all knew was approaching. "There," Marshal Harrison said as the telegraph key sparked to life. "The line's still connected. I can reach Helena if—" The sharp crack of a rifle shot split the mountain air, and the window beside Kane exploded in a shower of glass and splintered wood. He threw himself sideways, drawing his Colt .45 as he hit the floor. "They found us," Deputy Walsh announced grimly, taking position at the back window. "I count at least 8 riders coming up the trail, maybe more in the trees." Sheriff Bradley grabbed the telegraph key and began tapping out an urgent message in Morse code, his fingers flying over the brass lever with desperate speed. "Need 30 seconds, he called out. "Just give me 30 seconds to get word to Helena." Another rifle shot punched through the wall near Mary Ellen's head, showering her with splinters. Kane crawled to her side, pushing her down behind the relative safety of the heavy wooden table where Patrick's precious documents lay scattered. "Can you use a gun?" he asked her. "Patrick taught me," she replied. Accepting the spare revolver Marshal Thompson offered her with hands that barely trembled. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, accompanied by the harsh voices of men who had come to kill rather than capture. Through the broken window, Kane could see Blackwood himself among the riders, his expensive coat and silver hair making him stand out among the rough gunmen he'd hired. "McAllister!" Blackwood's voice carried clearly through the thin mountain air. "Send out the woman and the documents, and the rest of you can ride away from this. You have 60 seconds to decide." "Go to hell!" Kane shouted back, earning a grim smile from Sheriff Bradley, who was still working furiously at the telegraph key. 10 seconds, the sheriff called out. "Almost got it through." The final rifle shot took out the telegraph line in a shower of sparks, cutting their connection to Helena just as Sheriff Bradley completed his message. Whether it had gone through completely was impossible to know. "That's it then," Marshal Harrison said, checking his rifle. "We do this the hard way." Kane counted their ammunition and considered their position. The mining station was solidly built, but had only 1 door and 2 windows, good for defense, but terrible for escape. They were outnumbered at least 2 to 1, possibly worse. "Mary Ellen," he said quietly, "take the documents and Patrick's deed. There's a root cellar behind the station if things go badly. Hide there until they leave." "I'm not abandoning you," she said firmly, clutching her revolver with determination that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her courage. "You're not abandoning anyone," Kane replied. "You're making sure Patrick's evidence survives even if we don't. That's what matters." Before she could argue further, the attack began in earnest. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions simultaneously as Blackwood's men tried to overwhelm the defenders through sheer volume of lead. The air inside the station filled with gun smoke and the deafening crash of bullets splintering wood. Marshal Thompson took a bullet in the shoulder but kept fighting, his rifle barking steadily at the muzzle flashes in the trees. Deputy Walsh held the back window against 2 gunmen trying to flank them, his shots carefully aimed and devastatingly accurate. Kane found himself moving with the cold precision that had made him a feared soldier 20 years earlier. Each shot, from his Colt .45 was deliberate and measured, conserving ammunition while making every bullet count. But even as he fought, he kept one eye on Mary Ellen, making sure she stayed protected behind the heavy table. "They're coming for the door," Sheriff Bradley shouted, dropping his empty rifle and drawing his sidearm. The mining station's wooden door exploded inward under the impact of multiple bodies, and suddenly the fight was at close quarters, desperate, brutal, and personal. Kane put 2 bullets into the first man through the door, but more kept coming, their faces twisted with the ugly determination of men who killed for money rather than principle. Through the chaos and gun smoke, Kane saw Mary Ellen pressed against the far wall, Patrick's documents clutched against her chest like a shield. Their eyes met across the battlefield that the mining station had become, and in that instant, both knew that whatever happened next would determine not just who lived or died, but whether justice would survive to see another day. The sound that changed everything wasn't gunfire or shouting. It was the clear, resonant toll of a church bell echoing across the mountain valley. The bronze voice that had been silent in Bitter Ridge for 5 years now rang out with triumphant authority, carrying a message that stopped the gunfight as surely as if divine intervention had descended upon the mining station. Through the broken windows came the thunder of hooves, not the scattered approach of hired killers, but the disciplined charge of organized cavalry. Federal marshals, deputy U.S. marshals, and territorial militia poured into the clearing around the mining station, their badges gleaming and their weapons trained on Blackwood's suddenly outnumbered gunmen. "Drop your weapons," commanded a voice that carried absolute authority. "This is Marshal General Hayes, with federal warrants for Theodore Blackwood and Associates." The transformation in the gunfight was instantaneous and complete. Blackwood's hired thugs, brave enough when they held the advantage, lost all stomach for fighting when faced with legitimate law enforcement. Weapons clattered to the ground as hands shot skyward in surrender. Kane lowered his smoking Colt, .45, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. Through the doorway stepped a tall man with silver hair and a marshal's star that caught the afternoon light. Marshal General Hayes himself, the highest-ranking federal law enforcement officer in the territory. "Mr. McAllister, Miss Walsh," the Marshal General said with a respectful nod. "Sheriff Bradley's telegraph message came through just in time. We've been tracking Mr. Blackwood's illegal activities for months, but your evidence was the key we needed." Mary Ellen stepped forward, Patrick's document still clutched protectively against her chest. Her grey dress was torn and dusty from the battle, but her green eyes blazed with the fire of victory long delayed. "You received the message?" she asked, hardly daring to hope. "Every word," Marshal General Hayes confirmed. "The territorial judge has already issued emergency injunctions halting all Continental Railroad construction pending a full federal investigation. Mr. Blackwood and his associates will be transported to Helena immediately to face charges of conspiracy, murder, and fraud." Blackwood himself stood in the center of the clearing, his expensive coat now dirty and his silver hair disheveled. The arrogant confidence that had marked him during his threatening visit to the McAllister ranch had evaporated, replaced by the defeated slump of a man who had gambled everything and lost. "This isn't over," he snarled, as federal marshals placed him in shackles. "The Continental Railroad has connections in Washington influence you can't imagine." "Perhaps," Marshal General Hayes replied calmly, "but they don't have the kind of evidence that Mrs. Walsh is carrying. Evidence that proves your company has been systematically murdering anyone who threatened to expose your illegal land acquisition schemes." The title Mrs. Walsh hung in the air with strange resonance. Mary Ellen was still legally Patrick's widow, still bound to a man whose love lived on in the documents she protected and the justice she'd helped secure. But as Kane looked at her standing in the afternoon light, he saw not just the keeper of another man's legacy, but a woman strong enough to honor the past while building toward the future. As Blackwood and his remaining thugs were led away in chains, the bell continued to ring across the mountains, not the frantic alarm of crisis, but the steady, joyful peal of celebration. Someone in Bitter Ridge had climbed the church tower and restored the voice that Kane had silenced in his grief, calling the community to witness the dawn of a new day. "How did you know to come?" Sheriff Bradley asked the Marshal General as they watched the prisoners being loaded into a transport wagon. "Your telegraph message reached us just as we were preparing to move against the railroad based on other evidence we'd gathered," Hayes explained. "But more importantly, word has been spreading throughout the territory about what was happening here. Seems Mr. McAllister's decision to stand and fight inspired others to come forward with their own stories of railroad intimidation." Kane felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight bands of isolation and bitterness that had constricted his heart for 5 years. He'd thought he was fighting just to protect his own land and his own people, but somehow his stand had become a symbol for everyone who'd been bullied and threatened by forces beyond their control. "The Continental Railroad itself will face federal investigation," Marshal General Hayes continued. "With the evidence you've provided, we expect to uncover corruption that reaches all the way to their Washington offices. This victory will resonate far beyond Bitter Ridge." Mary Ellen walked to the edge of the clearing where she could look down into the valley toward their home. The church bell continued its joyful song, and Kane could see other bells answering from communities throughout the territory, a bronze chorus celebrating the triumph of justice over corruption. "It's finished," she said softly as Kane joined her. "Patrick's work is finished," he agreed. "But ours is just beginning." Mary Ellen turned to face him, her eyes bright with tears of relief and something deeper, something that looked like love tempered by loss and strengthened by shared struggle. "What happens now?" she asked. Kane took her hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the trembling that revealed her humanity. Below them, the bell tower of Bitter Ridge stood silhouetted against the setting sun, its bronze voice carrying the promise of new beginnings across the mountain valleys. "Now we go home," he said simply, "and we find out what kind of life two people can build when they're finally free to choose love over fear." 6 months later, the church bell of Bitter Ridge rang out across the valley with the same joyful voice that had announced justice on that snow-swept mountain day. But today, its bronze song carried a different message, one of hope renewed and love reborn from the ashes of loss. Mary Ellen stood before the mirror in what had once been Sarah's bedroom, now transformed into something entirely new while still honoring what had come before. The wedding dress she wore was simple but elegant, cream-colored silk that caught the morning light and made her auburn hair shine like burnished copper. At her throat hung not Patrick's cross, that now rested in a place of honor on the mantelpiece beside Thomas's toy soldiers, but a new necklace that Kane had given her, a delicate gold chain holding a small heart-shaped locket. "You look beautiful," said Margaret Henderson, whose family had returned to Bitter Ridge after the railroad's defeat to rebuild their farm, with compensation money provided by the federal government. "Like a woman who's finally coming home to herself." Through the window, Mary Ellen could see the transformation that had swept through Bitter Ridge in the months since Blackwood's arrest. The Continental Railroad, under new management and federal oversight, had indeed built their line, but along one of Patrick's alternative routes that connected existing communities rather than destroying them. The town now boasted a proper train station, bringing commerce and visitors while preserving the character that made it special. More importantly, the people had changed. The fear that had gripped the community for months had been replaced by a quiet confidence, a knowledge that they had faced down corruption and emerged stronger. Children played in streets where adults had once whispered anxiously about the future, and the sound of hammers and saws spoke of growth rather than desperate repairs. "Are you ready?" asked Reverend Cross, who had traveled from Pine Valley to perform the ceremony. He wore the smile of a man who had witnessed many joys in his long career, but few as meaningful as this union of two souls who had found each other through shared grief and mutual courage. Mary Ellen nodded, her hand instinctively moving to the locket at her throat. Inside, she carried two small photographs, one of Patrick and Michael, and one of Sarah and Thomas. Kane had insisted she include Patrick's image, understanding that honoring the past was essential to building a future. "He would have wanted this," the Reverend said gently, understanding her gesture. "Both of them would have wanted you to find happiness again." The ceremony took place in the newly restored church, its doors thrown open for the first time in 5 years. Sunlight streamed through windows that had been cleaned and repaired, illuminating pews filled with the entire population of Bitter Ridge and surrounding ranches. These people had watched their community nearly die and had seen it reborn through the courage of two people who refused to surrender to despair. Kane stood at the altar, wearing a suit of deep blue rather than his characteristic black, the change in color symbolic of the transformation that had taken place in his heart. The silver pocket watch still hung from his vest, but its hands now moved freely, marking the passage of time that had become precious rather than painful. When Mary Ellen appeared in the doorway, the congregation rose as one, but Kane saw only her, the woman who had entered his house as a stranger and had somehow become the key to unlocking everything good he'd thought was lost forever. As she walked down the aisle, he remembered that first evening when her humming had disturbed the silence he'd cultivated for so long. Now he understood that she hadn't been disturbing his peace, she'd been offering him a different kind of peace, one built on love rather than isolation. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Cross began, his voice carrying clearly through the small church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have learned that love is not diminished by loss, but made more precious by our knowledge of how fragile and valuable it truly is." The vows they exchanged were simple but profound, each word chosen with the care of people who understood the weight of promises. When Kane slipped the new wedding ring onto Mary Ellen's finger, a simple gold band to complement the one she would always wear in memory of Patrick, the church bell began to ring again, its voice joined by others throughout the territory in celebration of hope, triumphant. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Cross announced with evident joy. As Kane's lips met Mary Ellen's in their first kiss as husband and wife, the entire congregation erupted in applause and celebration. But for the two people at the center of it all, the world had narrowed to this single moment, a beginning disguised as an ending, a promise that some stories could have second acts filled with grace and redemption. The reception took place in the ranch house that had been silent for so long and now rang with laughter and conversation. Tables groaned under the weight of food prepared by every family in the county, and the sound of children's laughter echoed through rooms that had forgotten what joy sounded like. As evening approached and their guests began to depart, Kane and Mary Ellen found themselves alone on the front porch, where they had first begun to trust each other. The stars were emerging in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle announced the arrival of the evening freight, not a sound of threat now, but of progress and connection. "No regrets?" Kane asked, taking his wife's hand in his. "Only that it took us so long to find each other," Mary Ellen replied, leaning against his shoulder with the contentment of someone who had finally found home. In the years that followed, the story of Kane McAllister and Mary Ellen Walsh would become legend in Bitter Ridge, a tale told to children and grandchildren about the power of love to triumph over loss, of courage to overcome corruption, and of hope to transform even the most broken hearts. The church bell still rings every Sunday, calling the faithful to worship and reminding the community that some things, love, justice, and the bonds that tie people together, are worth fighting for. And in the house where silence once reigned supreme, the sounds of a new family growing and thriving serve as daily proof that while grief may be the price we pay for love, it need not be love's final word. Sometimes, if we're brave enough to trust again, love writes its own sequel, one filled with the same joy and wonder that made the first story worth telling.